Hello and welcome. I'm Suzanne Goldberg, Executive Vice President for University Life, and I am so glad to welcome all of you here to today's University Life Forum, Black Lives Matter, Protest and Creating Change. Today's forum is part of University Life's ongoing campus conversation series on the pressing issues of our time. And while we do not usually gather as a university community in the summer, the issues before us cannot wait. We are a large group today, more than 2,000 from across the university, including everyone from first-year undergraduates to graduate and professional school students, from faculty and staff at every school in the university, and senior leaders from across the institution. We also have many with us here from outside of Columbia University and from around the country. And on behalf of the university, I welcome all of you today. George Floyd's brother testified in Congress yesterday at a hearing on police accountability, asking members to make sure that his older brother, George Floyd, is more than another face on a t-shirt, more than another name on a list that won't stop growing. His testimony came against the backdrop of a pandemic that has put a powerful spotlight on the inequalities rooted deeply in our cities, our institutions, and our neighborhoods. We have seen for months now in the African American communities, along with other Black and Latinx communities, disproportionately experiencing the harms caused by COVID-19, severe illness, death, and economic suffering. Yet even a few weeks ago, it would have been impossible to imagine that police accountability for anti-Black violence would be the subject of a congressional hearing, or that in Minneapolis, the city would decide to defund its police department, or that New York State lawmakers would vote to repeal a law that protected police disciplinary records from public scrutiny. We've seen years and decades of protest, research, analysis, and hearings, including significant efforts by many of the participants in today's forum, and many other faculty and students and centers and institutes from throughout Columbia. But we have rarely, if ever, seen such momentum for change. From my own experience being part of some of the recent protests and reading and watching in many other fora, the change feels palpable, very personal to me. It is a time of reckoning, not only about police violence, but also about the embedding of racial bias and beliefs, explicit or implicit, that pervades American society. Within our own university, while we have done steady and in some parts of the institution relentless work, it is certainly not enough. As President Bollinger wrote to the university community recently, universities are not perfect, and we have to accept our share of responsibility for the state of affairs we have today. But we are determined, he wrote, even more so now, to change and to be better. There is much to be done, and there is great will to build on the momentum that has brought so many more in our community into heightened levels of action and commitment to create meaningful change. For Columbia students and faculty and staff interested in being part of action-oriented conversations specifically about the work of the university, please also join us next Wednesday for a special summer convening of University Life's Task Force on Inclusion and Belonging at Columbia. You can find more information on University Life's website, www.universitylife.columbia.edu. It's in the Inclusion and Belonging section. I also want to thank the many people across Columbia who have already reached out with ideas, with concerns, with suggestions, and to many of you who have shared questions for today's forum. We will keep these questions with us as a guide, not only for today, but to inform our work going forward. I'll turn now to a few technical notes and then about today's forum and then to introductions. If you're watching on Zoom, you can use the Q&A feature at any time during the conversation to pose questions or offer comments. If you're watching on the live stream, or if you have ideas for other forums or comments and questions about other issues, please email them to us at universitylife@columbia.edu. If you have technical difficulties while watching, you can exit Zoom and log back in, or just go directly to University Life's website for the live stream. Again, universitylife.columbia.edu. It's open to all. If any of us freezes during the forum, We'll log out and get back in as quickly as we can. With that, I'll introduce our speakers. I feel personally fortunate to have such awe-inspiring colleagues. And although these introductions will be very brief, I encourage you to look them all up afterwards to learn more about the extraordinary work and the recognition that each of them has received for their many contributions. First is Dennis Mitchell, who will offer additional framing for today's conversation. Dr. Mitchell and I will then take our seats, as it were, to the extent you can take your seats on Zoom, and then we'll rejoin the conversation whenever our moderator, Jelani Cobb, calls us back in for the Q&A. Dr. Mitchell is Columbia's Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement and a Professor of Dental Medicine at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. As Vice Provost, he is responsible for leading the university's ongoing commitment to attract and advance and retain a diverse faculty. And as a longtime member of the College of Dental Medicine faculty, he has a deep commitment to the oral health needs of underserved populations in the communities surrounding Columbia. Jelani Cobb is our moderator for today's conversation. He is the Ira A. Lipman Professor of the Ira A. Lipman Professor of Journalism at the Columbia School of Journalism. Professor Cobb is also a staff writer at the New Yorker magazine, and I'm sure many people, both among all of us and in our audience, read his work every time, as soon as it comes out. He writes frequently about race, politics, history, and culture. He's the author of several books, including The Substance of Hope, Barack Obama, and the Paradox of Progress. Courtney Cogburn is Associate Professor at the Columbia School of Social Work, where she directs a research group that uses an innovative transdisciplinary approach to characterize and measure racism and its effects on mental and physical health. Professor Cogburn is the lead creator of 1000 Cut Journey, an immersive virtual reality racism experience that was developed in collaboration with the Virtual Human Interaction Lab at Stanford and premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2018. Robert Fullilove is Professor of Sociomedical Sciences at Columbia University Irving Medical Center and Associate Dean for Community and Minority Affairs at the Mailman School of Public Health, and one of the first people I met when I took my role as Executive Vice President for University Life here. Professor Fullilove is a public health leader and a civil rights activist. He has authored many articles about minority health and has held positions with the Board of Health Promotion and Disease Prevention within the National Academy of Sciences, at the Centers for Disease Control, and the National Institutes of Health. Frank Guridy is Associate Professor in the Departments of History and of African American and African Diaspora Studies within Columbia's Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Professor Guridy specializes in sports history, urban history, and the history of the African diaspora in the Americas, and he has written several books as well, including Forging Diaspora, Afro-Cubans and African Americans in a World of Empire and Jim Crow. His forthcoming book is about how sports entrepreneurs and athletes from marginalized backgrounds transformed America's sporting culture during the 1960s and 70s. Olatunde Johnson is the Jerome B. Sherman Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. Her research has helped shape the national conversation on modern civil rights legislation, anti-discrimination, fair housing, and innovations to address discrimination and inequality. Professor Johnson brings extensive public service experience to her work, including having served as constitutional and civil rights counsel to Senator Ted Kennedy and litigating civil rights cases at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Thank you all so much for being here. I will Dennis Mitchell, I will hand the mic over to you. So please take on the mic. Thanks very much again to all of you for being here.
Thank you, Suzanne, and good afternoon, everyone. As Suzanne had mentioned, I'm Dennis Mitchell, Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement here at Columbia University. And it's hard to believe that just 1 month ago, we were all facing only one major pandemic, the effects of COVID-19 on our work, on our lives, on our families, our mobility, on our children's education, on our own education. But yet, here we are. After the tragic murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, we witness in footage that continues to be seared in our memories the deaths of the latest victims, of additional centuries-old epidemic of Black deaths at the hands of police and self-appointed vigilantes at times. Former Defense Secretary James Mathis recently stated that we now have an administration that does not try to unite the American people and does not even pretend to try. Instead, it tries to divide us. What we are witnessing is actually the consequences of 401 years of this deliberate effort. As grim and as disappointing as this may sound, Mathis is hopeful, and we should be too. He remarked that we can unite, and I think that's what we're doing right now. We're doing it in the streets. This epidemic has mobilized a more unified, more urgent response, not from prominent officials, but from crowds of protesters around the world. And this is why we're here today, because Black lives matter. I'd like to take a moment, Suzanne and I both take a moment, really to just take a moment of silence for Ahmaud Arbery, for Breonna Taylor, for George Floyd, for the countless others whose names we know, and for those whose names are lost to history, and for our ancestors. Please join with me, let's just take a moment. I know that many of you are grieving right now. I'm definitely grieving right now. Yet, here we are at Columbia University, an institution with its own fraught racial history. Academia itself, flawed arena for addressing systemic racism, but it can also be a very powerful one. So we will work to harness our emotions, our skills, our talents to help our community move forward. I want to thank you for organizing this incredible event with over 2,000 of you registering out there. I must acknowledge President Lee Bollinger and Provost Ira Katz-Nelson, whose leadership provides the foundation for this work to happen in a courageous way that we're trying to move it forward. I'd like to offer sincere thanks to our incredible list of speakers, all of whom are great colleagues, and some of them are very dear friends. During this week of the funeral of George Floyd, I acknowledge that we are still grieving, and our healing is yet to come. We are all here to do this work of lifting the university, ourselves, and each other, and continuing this conversation, because we all must give whatever we have to help our nation. This is our first formal university-wide presentation to address racial violence. We are continuing that you will receive by email tomorrow of a series of 4 more events that we will launch over this summer. And I hope to see so many of you join us as we move forward. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's session, Jelani Cobb.
Thank you, Dennis. I'd like to start by thanking Dennis and Suzanne for their visionary conceptualization of having this. And when we spoke earlier this week, just the urgency of having this forum and this discussion, was not lost on either of us. And so I'm glad that we're able to have this conversation. And beyond that, I'm glad that there are so many people in the Columbia community who, despite the many things that are going on right now, found the time to participate in this dialogue, not the least of whom I'd also like to thank our distinguished panelists. So I want to, and because we're working from home, you may hear my twins in the background. They just woke up from a nap, so there's the actual life experience happening here. But I want to start by just asking you all personally how you processed what has happened in the last 3 weeks, the last month, and we can talk about professionally. I have lots of things I want to know, from your professional vantage points on this. But I want to know how you, as individuals, reckoned with this moment that we're in right now?
Thank you, Jelani. Yeah, I also want to thank Dennis and Suzanne for organizing this discussion. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I feel privileged to be here. I kind of want to pick up on some things that Dennis just mentioned, kind of the emotional aspect of all this. I think since the onset of the pandemic here in New York City in March, I've been feeling this cocktail of emotions of anger, rage, despair, sadness, anxiety, gratitude on the verge sometimes of survivor guilt for being alive and actually being able to have the privilege of sheltering in place, as we watch when we do go outside, people who are deemed essential workers, many of them Black and brown and immigrants, struggle to keep this city and this country going in the midst of this, And then as the news of the recent murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd came out, it's just more of the same, right? And so it's been challenging emotionally as it is, and yet I've been inspired by what I've seen over the last, as many of us are, week and a half, 2 weeks of the extraordinary mobilization that we've seen. What I sort of said in a piece I wrote last week, kind of a revitalization of American democracy that I see happening in the streets. And so it's this combination of things that have, on the one hand, are novel to this moment in this country's city. And yet, as a Black person, as a historian, these are familiar feelings, right? The feelings that I would have felt or thought after Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown were murdered, right? After watching Black New Orleanians suffering in despair during the Katrina catastrophe, right? After so many moments like this in Black history and the history of marginalized peoples in this country. And so, it's one of these things where you're encountering something you've seen before as a person who's in its late 40s, and as a native New Yorker, also, and seeing the extreme disparities, racial disparities in the city, playing out and be made more manifest in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so all of these things are, like many of us, we're processing all of these things at the same time. And it's created, it's been an emotional challenge, but it's also a moment of opportunity, even in my own life, I think, as a citizen of this country. That's what I would say.
Yeah, for me, it feels like I'm just tired and writing this, what I've described as sort of this wave of racial trauma that's so common in the Black experience in the United States, where, the anger and pain, and then you're inspired and feeling empowered and engaged by the protests and just sort of going up and down and up and down. And I think for me as well, and probably for many of us, when our work overlaps so much with what's so personal, in this moment, it's very difficult to strike a balance between your professional engagement, the ways in which you're positioned to have positive impact on where we go next, and self-care. And so for me, it's been quite a challenge to try and balance those two. And it started with COVID-19, right? And the racial inequities that we knew were going to emerge and inevitably bared out in the data, and having to sort of impact our discussion around that and how we're framing that narrative and what we do next. And then this hits. And so it's just an ongoing roller coaster in some ways that I'm actively trying to manage.
We have a request for the panelists to please state their names at the outset of their comments. So,
I'm Courtney Cogburn, Associate Professor in the School of Social Work.
And I'm Bob Fullilove. I'm a professor of Sociomedical Sciences and the Associate Dean of Community and Minority Affairs at the Mailman School of Public Health here at Columbia. I'm the oldest guy on this panel. I was born in 1944, but let's process that for a moment. I'm having an experience of deja vu.
You're having.
I'm having the experience of deja vu. From 1964 to 1967, I was a field secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. My career in civil rights was pretty well bookended by police violence. In 1964, basically beginning next week, 56 years ago, I was part of a whole cohort of college students from the North who were going to Mississippi to help Black voters register to vote in what was called Mississippi Freedom Summer. The first day of Mississippi Freedom Summer, the cops killed 3 of our colleagues. The police in Neshoba County, Mississippi, were intimately a part of a gang that descended on these students, arrested them, and ultimately killed them so that their bodies would be discovered just at a moment when the Democratic National Convention was about to nominate Lyndon Baines Johnson as its candidate for the presidency in the '64 presidential elections. I stayed with SNCC in Mississippi in '64 and '65 while being a college student who traveled back and forth between Holly Springs, Natchez, and a bunch of other places. But in 1966, when I graduated from college, I became an organizer in Newark, New Jersey, my hometown. Some of you are aware of the fact that next month we will basically commemorate the 53rd anniversary of one of the deadliest race riots, in quotation marks, in the history of the United States, when Newark, New Jersey went up in flames and Detroit went up just after it. That too was a riot that was precipitated, all too expectedly, by police violence against a cab driver whose outrageous treatment was basically the reason why those riots broke out. I was living in Scudder Homes in 1967. I'd just been married. My then wife was expecting our son. All of a sudden, from Scudder Homes, you saw a whole host of folk basically going out, and you heard cries, "It's on." The National Guard descended on Newark and started shooting up Hayes homes. Many of the deaths that were recorded in that period were because of National Guard and police violence. The Kerner Report, which was released in 1968 with the sponsorship of Lyndon Baines Johnson, made recommendations that many folk feel look exactly like a blueprint for change that we would create if we were to confront the problems that we're seeing in the United States today. My sense of deja vu is especially heightened by the fact that I've been teaching in prisons in the state of New York for the last 10 years. Now that we're on the whole notion of how U.S. has changed as a result of COVID-19, the fact that our prison industrial complex is basically a way in which we exert social control over Black and Latinx men means that people found themselves in centers that were particularly vulnerable to the impact of COVID-19. The degree to which governors throughout the United States failed to deal with the threat that was posed to incarcerated persons makes me feel that some of the lessons that we should have learned in 1968 still need to be taught. I'm in a school of public health where we're really interested in how COVID-19 is changing the landscape and the geography of New York. I'm really interested in working with students because they have shown that, like the students in 1964, they're ready, able, and really willing to do something to change the nature of community life in places where a pandemic like COVID-19 is going to wreak havoc. Although I'm experiencing a sense of deja vu, if it's okay to say this at the age of 76, I kind of remain optimistic.
So, hello everyone. Thank you for this panel. I'm Olatunde Johnson. I'm a professor of law at the law school, and my emotions, actually, even though we're all different people, really the things you described really resonate with me. So I think that my overarching emotion is the sense of what Robert Fullilove just captured, which is that this feels familiar and utterly different at the same time. So the night that everything really exploded, Saturday, May 30th, in terms of some of the protests in Harlem, the streets were filled with protesters all day and fairly organized, but a lot of different protests along a lot of different avenues. And I live in Harlem. And by night, things had become more convulsive, a little bit more chaotic. There were a lot more violent police citizen encounters. And I walked around the corner at midnight with my daughter, actually, and we could hear all the helicopters overhead. There were sirens, people throwing bottles. I mean, there was a lot going on. And it was this feeling of this is a profoundly unsettling time, and that there was a lot of emotion, I think, that you've all expressed that was descending on the city in that moment. The next day, I woke up Sunday morning, beautiful day. Harlem was in some ways back to Harlem. People were sweeping their stoops and taking walks to go to Central Park. And I walked over to the Frederick Douglass statue and I thought, you know, what does this moment represent? Why now? What's going to change? What's going to stay the same?
You know, I'm struck by that description because it brings to mind the James Baldwin essay where he talks about the 1942 uprising in Harlem. And that too, like the one in 1935, 7 years before it, was prompted by an instance of police excessive use of force. And if we were to look at this, just kind of to follow up on Bob's point, we were to look at this in the long vantage point, 1935, 1942 in Harlem, 1942 in Detroit, 1965 in Harlem, 1965 in Watts, 1967 in Newark, as you mentioned, 1967 in Detroit, 1967 in Minneapolis, which is something I did not know until last week. Also precipitated by police violence, 1992, Los Angeles, 2014, Ferguson. We could kind of go through, and there are lots. That's a kind of highlight reel almost. There are lots of other instances like this that we haven't talked about. Miami, also. And so I wondered if we could talk about this just in terms of how you make sense of this professionally. We have the diverse array of fields here. And I wondered what your professional vantage point was when you start looking at these things through the lens of the way that you approach the world intellectually.
Jelani, I think to your point, I think siren starting as soon as I start speaking. For me, it's felt a lot like should I wait until the siren passes?
We're all in New York, so we're accustomed to it.
So for me, honestly, it feels a little bit like the Twilight Zone. I'm a little bit confused, like why in this moment people are reacting so differently, and I've been trying to engage in some analysis of, and I understand the technical points of this, right? That the particular circumstances of George Floyd's death in particular, the socio-political moment we're in, COVID-19 consequence. I understand the technical points of all of that, but I'm really looking around at in particular, white people reacting in such a different way, corporations reacting in such a different way than I've seen in the past. And it's at the same point, both an amazement and absurd in many ways. That for me, this is not much different than anything else we've seen or experienced in terms of the circumstances that people have been yelling and screaming about for centuries. So I think from an intellectual point of view, I'm trying to understand what is it about this moment that feels so different to people? Is it an accumulation? Is there something about the unique characteristics surrounding these particular events, the sequence of events? So intellectually, that's interesting to me.
Can I ask you a question? Can I follow up with that? And I'll ask this of everyone. Did it anger you in any regard that white people have been cloaked from this reality enough for Mr. Floyd's death to be a novel shock to their systems?
Oh, it's infuriating. It's and again, in sort of the surprise that people seem to be expressing, as if we have not always lived here, as if we have not always lived in this place under these circumstances. The ways in which I've seen people reject the significance of race and racism and anti-Black racism in particular in the analysis of problems, in interventions and solutions that are being forwarded, and try to use this sort of blanket term of diversity. It's incredibly infuriating, while also acknowledging that it's amazing that people are turning a corner, reacting differently. So it's a complicated reaction for me. Intellectually, and really also intellectually, really trying to ground the conversations in which I'm engaging, the work that I'm engaging, really centering anti-Black racism in particular, which is another thing that people keep avoiding, right? They at first would avoid talking about race and racism, and now I'm seeing some resistance to naming and centering anti-Blackness in particular in what we're observing. And so for me, those are two components that are driving some of my intellectual work.
spent the first half of my professional life as an educator. One of the interesting things about the Kerner report that folks don't recall, and remember, the Kerner report was issued in 1968 as a specific response to urban violence in the United States in 1967.
That's right.
I keep thinking that people remember history, and I know that's actually not the case. The Kerner report was absolutely significant because its opening gambit was to say, we are a nation rapidly moving towards a situation where there will be one white and one black, separate and unequal. A whole host of its recommendations really dealt with issues of how we could make things better. So here we are, basically in 2020, looking back at the Kerner report and really being clear that in 1968, we really had a clear notion of what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to do it. When I got out of the civil rights movement and decided that I could do better in public health than I could in education, it was for one simple reason. In public health, you can actually name racism as the culprit and get money to do something about it. You could tie all the things that we've seen with COVID-19 directly to the impact that racism has had on the health of Black Americans, as well as on the health of every American. Because what we've seen with this horrible pandemic is that just because you are privileged and live far away, what has haunted us and killed us in greater numbers than you still has the power to do you in. Look at the Prime Minister of England. So all of a sudden, we now have a way in which we can use the language of public health as a way of really helping people understand through the lens of this pandemic how racism impacts health, how it impacts every facet of American life, and how some of the things that we have to do just to keep ourselves safe from this virus have everything to do with what we can do effectively to combat racism. I see that at least as a real opportunity in the defund the police notion, where we're saying, look, it's not about getting rid of the police. It's about understanding that if we use police to exercise social control that's created because we don't know what to do about homelessness, we don't know what to do about unemployment, we don't know what to do about mental illness. If we're really clear that maybe the investment that we make in the police, which is typically the largest element of the budget in almost every major city in the United States, and spend some of that money on the things that the police never were intended to do, like control the problems that are created by homelessness, the problems that are created by mental illness. Maybe we'll have a different way of understanding how life in the United States should work, and maybe the reinvestment of some of the resources that we're currently investing in the police can create a vision of a new America that is a little bit more diverse, a little bit more equal, and a little less subject to all the kinds of horrors that we've experienced as a result of COVID-19.
Yeah. So, I mean, my work is really on law and social movements and also looking at the limits of first generation of civil rights remedies. It doesn't leave me with completely clear answers of this moment either. I mean, we're all seeing something partial. It's in progress. I think it's too early to name exactly all the aspects of this and what will result. That said, what I'm really struck by is just the breadth of the reaction, just how many different cities it's happening in and communities, and a lot of people telling the stories of their own communities as a result. You know, what has happened in our community? How are we complicit? And I think there's more to say on that. I mean, people have already alluded to just the fact of the pandemic, the very toxic political leadership we have coming from the White House that sort of fans the flames of all of this. That's obviously playing a role here. But I think more optimistically, one might look at the groundwork that has been laid by social movements. And so there's Black Lives Matter, but there are also all of the movements around mass incarceration, prison abolition, police reform for the last 20 years. And really, a lot of those intensified their actions in the last 5 years. So there's been a lot of what groups on the ground call moving away from the traditional civil rights model to a more power building model that tries to do a lot more organizing in communities. So I think that that's playing a role in all of this. And then the last thing I'd just say is just also to pay attention to the culture. We often don't know when that makes a difference to have things like 13 or have all of my students who had read the new Jim Crow before starting law school and that it was standard reading. Brian Stevenson's museum in Alabama and his whole project of marking slave auction sites and places where lynchings happened. 1619. I mean, those things do prime people to have a structural analysis in a different way.
I guess I didn't say who I was when I first spoke. Frank Guridy, History Department, African and American and African Diaspora Studies. I'm going to pick up on the thread that Professor Johnson and others have already touched on. So I'm a historian of Black freedom movements, social movements, focus on cities and sports. And I am really struck by the ways in which the mobilization of our time is building on longstanding organizing traditions that go back not just in recent years from Occupy, even Me Too, the Women's March, but certainly centrally all the mobilizing by Black communities and Black activists around prison abolition, police violence, mass incarceration. Right, we see the fruits of that organizing labor happening right now, bearing fruit right now, and I think that's really delightful to see. To be honest with you. And yet that combined with the conditions that we've been facing since the onset of the pandemic and the utter disregard, certainly by the federal government, to those who've been suffering the most from the pandemic, massive unemployment, anger and frustration that we see here, all of it, certainly in New York City, and then the disparities that inform them. I mean, they're coming together into this fascinating combustible moment that is really interesting to behold. But as Robin Kelly said this morning on Democracy Now!, again, the fact that people could just go to Black Lives Matters and they know the rhetoric is because of the organizing that's happened for several years now. And as a scholar of sport, I am very struck by the ways in which this reverberates in the sporting world, right? By Colin Kaepernick's taking the knee, which of course, even before that, women who were playing for the WNBA, New York Liberty, Carolyn Soares, Kia Stokes, Tina Charles, and others, right, were already speaking about police violence weeks before Colin Kaepernick took the knee in the preseason of 2016, the NFL season. And to see this moment reverberating in the sporting world, right, is interesting. One, because sport historically has been a place where the United States likes to think of itself as a meritocratic force. It's a space that has had an important role in the Black freedom movement from Jackie Robinson forward, and even before that, of course, right? And to see this unprecedented moment of athletic activism is very striking to me, and how sport becomes a space to debate and fight about these questions that have been happening over the last few years. And so as a historian, I see this in this longer context that Bob already laid out for us. But then I think there is something unique about this moment, the cross-racial nature of it, the explicitly cross-racial, even as it's Black-led of the mobilization. And even the response, the formulaic responses by corporate America and institutions, including our own in some corners, is very interesting, something worthy of discussion, but perhaps later, right? I mean, all of these are happening in real time, but they're noteworthy in themselves and something we should keep talking about and organizing around moving forward.
I think, so I've written a lot of stories on this issue. I was counting up this morning about them. And personally, I kind of don't know how to keep writing about it, because I feel like at some point you sit down at the computer and you go, all right, I've said all that needs to be said. That's all. I've said everything that I can think to say on this subject. And I think it's my 3-year-old. Daddy's busy right now. I told you were going to get authenticity today. So, but one of the things that I've noticed in having a framework for a lot of these different stories is that when I went to Baltimore, when I went to Ferguson, when any of these communities things like this have happened, people would talk about the incident with the police, but it would almost always be in the context of other things. Ferguson was striking. People that wanted to talk about schools, they wanted to talk about unemployment. When you came and asked about what happened to Michael Brown, they wanted to talk about the poor condition of the roads. They wanted to talk about every institution that was interfacing with their lives. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the exacerbating factors, about what has to be in place before people revolt the way they did after George Floyd's death. Anyone can take that.
Yeah. So yeah, it's always been a source of fascination to me. I've spent more than 50 years watching students become engaged in social movements. I've been very clear as someone who had been there and at some levels done that. The most important thing about protest in the United States is that it often begins with anger. Here's the problem. You can't sustain anger. You can have a couple of weeks where everybody's pissed off, but then after that, it's like, oh, what else have we got? Something always comes to be in the forefront of the consciousness of the American public, and it's just very difficult to sustain anything. Sustainability, since my days in the civil rights movement, was always the thing that we talked about. How do you keep this going? You can get people angry, but how do you convert the anger into something that looks positive? Let me just say, as a guy who's been teaching since 1964, I'm really impressed with the young people that I'm seeing making their way into university life. I'm really impressed because I think more than anything else, they have a vision of the future in which they see more clearly how what they do can have a real impact on what's going on. I love the way my students not only embrace the idea that theoretically we should be doing something better, they're actually able to ask me the next question. So, okay, Doc, what do we do next? I see that as a part of what people are literally committing themselves to do as they choose careers. And I think the events of the last couple of months have done a lot to solidify amongst many folk in the audience the notion that if you're going to exist in this democracy in the next 20 years, you better get on the train. You better get on the bus because things are moving in many respects, you don't want to be left behind. Now, that's me again speaking with my optimism, but I've been around long enough to say that what I'm seeing today is qualitatively different than what occurred in the past. If for no other reason that I'm seeing rebellions in other urban areas where there are as many white people as there are black. Damn.
Salt Lake City. I saw Salt Lake City. I actually went and looked it up. The black population of Salt Lake City is 2.5%. And I was like, this is different.
Amen. Amen.
So I'm mindful of the time that we have, this kind of conversation is kind of whipping by, and I wanted to make sure we did get to some questions about actions and things that should happen. One of the things that has been, I think, a hallmark of this moment is that everything is on the table. The House just introduced very ambitious legislation. There are these conversations about defunding the police, that everyone is open to hearing any kind of solution for how we move forward. And I wonder what the four of you think are some things that we should consider as we do move forward.
So I'm happy to go first on this. So I think, you've touched on some of the things that are beginning to happen. I think just more some themes than what I think is most likely. I think it's really unclear what will be passed. But I think you're seeing a move beyond this idea of we're going to prosecute individual police officers and we're going to solve the problem that way, or that we're just going to do anti-bias training or hiring officers. A real theme is more forms of accountability, and that they have to be systemic forms of accountability. I think where the questions I have are how transformative are these changes going to be? What's going to be enacted? So, at the federal, state, and local level, you're already seeing efforts to ban particular practices like chokeholds and no-knock warrants that really have been behind a lot of these police killings. At the federal level, you're seeing proposals to amend civil rights laws to make it easier to hold the police accountable through civil rights litigation, qualified immunity issues. You're seeing proposals around demilitarization of the police, which are coming at the federal level, but also with states saying we are not going to accept money. And then you're seeing a range of transparency-based initiatives that I think are really important, better tracking of police officers who are disciplined or who engage in misconduct, tracking up nationally and within states. And there have been some, prominent efforts around that in New York. And then, just in conclusion, I guess I'd say that there are much more fundamental reforms that Jelani, you just touched on, that people are opening the conversation to have. And the idea there is that you want the police to be as democratically accountable as every other public institution, that we don't need to create experts, separate rules for it, and also that we're going to rethink how we produce public safety. So those range from shifting money away from policing to other social service programs at minimum, which some local officials are pledging to do, but even more transformative efforts that are just saying, well, we actually need a different kind of institution. If we're thinking about safety, sustainability, well-being, we need to reconstruct alternate models, and you see that in the defund campaign. And just in conclusion on that, I mean, I just would say that, I think there will be changes. How far-reaching is not clear. I mean, we have to be clear that there's an active movement on, the other side resisting a lot of these changes. In addition to just the garden variety gridlock and polarization that we have at the federal level. And it's also clear that there are disagreements, even among those who want some sort of transformative change in police departments as to what that looks like. So, there's still things to sort out, but I'm also hopeful that there will be progress on many of these initiatives.
Can I follow up just really quickly? How did it come to be that police departments have so little accountability? There's virtually no other public institution that you can think of that operates with the kind of impunity that policing does. And there's the argument that people risk their lives, every day, but firefighters risk their lives. As we've seen now, certainly first responders in the health field risking their lives about COVID-19. What is it about policing that has allowed this institution to go virtually unchecked?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could answer all the dimensions of that question because I've been thinking about it a lot. So the sort of technocratic legal answer is that we've constructed these doctrines to shield the police because in general, we want our public officials to be able to do their job without the threat of lawsuits, and even more so with regard to police officers who, as you say, put themselves in danger. But it doesn't begin to adequately capture why we've allowed it to sustain itself. I mean, for me, a real shift was that in law, we treat those things as immutable, that they're there, judges made them up, it's these doctrines, and that we have to adhere to them. I think what's interesting about the proposals on the table have been to say, actually, we can amend the civil rights law and we can rethink those doctrines. But it's also to imagine a different form of accountability. And I mean, I think that if you go to, why they have been unaccountable, I mean, I think it's rooted in the whole history of policing in this country, its connection, as many people have said, to racism, to slave patrols, and to keeping an order that in some ways is about preventing forms of economic advancement by African Americans. I mean, a long history of that in terms of forms of keeping public order and deputizing a police force that was essentially operating as the more a kind of visible branch of the Ku Klux Klan to keep public order and limit the advancement and inclusion of Black people. So there's a deeper history there. And I just will say, though, that I ask this question as a lawyer and as a law professor every day. I also ask it as someone whose first cousin was shot by the police and killed last March. They were executing a mental health warrant. So I wake up every day and I ask myself, why are the police less accountable than every other public institution? We would never allow this, to happen. And it goes to even questions about when you want police to be effective within your own community. I mean, I live in Harlem, and there are times in which me or my neighbors have wanted to have different kinds of conversations around what makes our neighborhood safe. And it's very hard to figure out how to penetrate that institution. And there's a lot more to say about sort of the use of data, the sort of the philosophies that are guiding police and police departments. And many of my colleagues at Columbia, there are more people we put on this panel who have been deep in policing as an institution who would have more to say about that. But just sort of the wave and of kind of the broken windows wave, as well as even the sort of some of the data-driven ideas of policing as being about arrests and not really about partnerships with community and the production of public safety in a collaborative way.
If I could just jump in here as the historian, or one of the historians, Professor Cobb is a historian too, as many of us know. In terms of this question of police accountability, of course, one of the most important areas of research in African American and American history is the research on the history of mass incarceration and policing, which has transformed our understanding of policing from and police violence from acts of rogue police officers to a structural culture of impunity and punishment that goes back certainly to the era of slavery, but really gets constituted in its modern form in the wake of the civil rights of the moment that Bob talked about, right? The 1960s, going back to the war on poverty. This is the work of Elizabeth Hinton, for example. I mean, Michelle Alexander and others has highlighted the 1994 crime bill, right? Which beefed up policing and punishment in urban communities and in other communities across the country. And then, of course, the post 9/11 militarization that has become part of our everyday life here is another factor, right? Which makes certain things acceptable, because even in the wake of the civil rights revolution and the Black freedom movement in the 1960s, one notion that never did change in the minds of many policymakers is that urban Black and Latinx communities are inherently pathological and in need of reform. And if they can't be reformed, then the option is to punish them in some way, shape, or form, right? And so this turn towards punitive measures towards the laboring majority of cities, Black in particular, is based on this notion, right? That doesn't ever change and still doesn't change even in the Obama era, right? Look, even Obama's reaction to the murder of Trayvon Martin, his sort of programs, which is still about reforming Black people to become better citizens and productive members of society, as opposed to addressing the institutions that repress them, like the police. That in tandem with the gentrification of American cities, right? I mean, the Amy Cooper moment, which now almost feels like ancient history, just a couple of weeks ago, right, illustrates the ways in which cities across this country and the world have been remade to be safe for the gentrifying classes, so that people can roam around and enjoy the amenities of the neoliberal city in a way in which they don't have to worry about their safety, right? I mean, all of these are rooted in these historical transformations that historians have shown that are really shaken up right now. And I think that's what's extraordinary about this moment, is that many of these assumptions, the Cooper moment, the protest, the murder itself of George Floyd, and the ways in which there's a certain way that video also highlights the kind of the routineness of the violence, right, has brought us to this point. And really part of it is really pushing on the Democratic Party in particular, right? I think the fact that this is an election year is going to keep these issues going, even if the protests start to wane a bit, and the ongoing struggles with the pandemic. It's going to ensure that people are going to be vigilant about what's happening right now, because as Hinton and others have shown, many of these policies were put in place or certainly overseen by Democratic, imagined liberal politicians who performed their rhetoric alliance with Black communities, but have overseen policies that really have dispossessed them in so many ways.
Can I just add one other historical note? Again, speaking as the old man in the panel. Folks, I think, would find it fascinating to look at Lyndon Baines Johnson, his war on poverty, the manner in which from 64 to 68, we as a nation actually deliberately engaged in an effort to eliminate poverty as a way of dealing with racial discrimination, as a way of dealing with the horrible history this country has had with racism. 1964 to 1968, and then we get Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon engages in a policy of benign neglect. He's really concerned about the degree to which he doesn't want to embrace any kind of policy that appears to be okay about civil rights. So he's given the advice, you don't have to do anything. In fact, why don't you focus on the fact that people worry about more than anything else? Drugs. How about we make a war on drugs? Because one of the things that will do is identify the people that we worry most about their behavior when they're under the influence. Black and Latinx people in our inner city communities. The war on drugs leads to mass incarceration. And I think we're still living with realities that go back to the fact that what people wanted more than anything else was not something that looked like a truly diverse nation where liberty and justice for all would prevail. No, they wanted social control. The police have always fundamentally been about in the United States, let's control the Black people. And to the degree that we have hid that desire to control this Black population under all kinds of laws, under all kinds of policies, mass incarceration being simply the worst. we're finally at a point where we're starting to see that maybe, just maybe, it's costing us too much money. It's leaving us deprived. It makes us exposed to illnesses in a variety of ways. What's the most important place you don't want to be in the midst of a viral epidemic like COVID-19? You don't want to be in a prison. And so it becomes very clear that if prisons become the place where other people in more well-advanced and well-endowed communities are going to be exposed to a virus like this, all of a sudden there's motivation to think, maybe not because of the issue of civil rights, maybe because we're just interested in preserving our health. It suddenly becomes obvious to people that some of these reforms are going to have to take place simply because it's the one way in which we can preserve whatever health we're able to achieve in a technologically advanced society like ours. It's one of the reasons why I continue to feel that this moment is one where we really get to look at all the ways in which the hidden attributes of a nation that built its wealth on slavery has now got to basically face a reckoning. And in the course of that reckoning, if we're going to continue, if we're going to survive, I think we're going to start thinking about new ways of approaching age-old problems. That's my hope.
I think going to your point, Jelani, about everything is on the table really resonates for me, because I think in addition to all the comments that are being made, it's clear to me how few people really understand, including those at Columbia, right, professors, et cetera, who really understand our racial history and the web of racism and the way it functions in our society. And from my perspective, that understanding and clarity is critical to any solution moving forward. We too often are putting a small band-aids, thinking very narrowly about how racism functions, a bias training, for instance, instead of thinking about fundamental shifts in institutions and culture. It's also resonating for me that I feel that we have rarely been in a position to imagine new futures and new societies. And we've often been focused on fighting for basic human rights. And we've rarely had the opportunity to sit and think about who do we really want to be. And if we think we might be in that moment right now, that's the level at which we should be thinking. We should be thinking about every facet of society, every facet of our institution, and how we're moving in the long run. How are we shifting those spaces to be what we want them to be, and not only thinking about policing and not only thinking about education, but thinking about the layers of racial oppression that overlap, as you alluded to earlier, that are fundamentally shaping our country. And if we're truly in a moment that we want to shift, I think it's important to move our framing in that direction. I think that thinking about Columbia in particular and what we need to do as an institution, it's one thing to fight for racial equity out there. It's quite another to think critically about ourselves, to pull our own receipts and think about who we have been and who we are, and how these very same systems and phenomena function within the university itself, and having a very honest conversation about that. And I think in terms of society and in terms of Columbia, Black people, activists, and scholars have already told us what needs to happen. They've repeated this over and over and over again. The people on this panel have written about this extensively. We know where the answers lie. And what we don't need to spend a lot of time doing is explaining yet again what racism is and how it's functioned in our country. We certainly need to move beyond that point to start doing something about it, because we certainly have enough data to start making some substantial moves if we truly want to achieve racial equity. And I think for me, the place where I am is that I'm no longer comfortable letting people believe that they're moving toward racial equity with these small iterative steps, as opposed to really making adjustments to who we are, how we function, and how we do our work in every facet of what that might entail.
I'm glad you raised that point, because it gets right into the first question. We have a ton of questions that were submitted, and so it is a natural segue into one of the questions that we got, which is, what is Columbia University's relationship with the NYPD? What are we going to do about systemic racism at Columbia? And there's not enough Black faculty, deans, and administrators. Those that have come in don't last. What can university leadership do to address racism at all levels with the university? And so I think I'll bring in Suzanne and Dennis to respond to that question specifically.
I'll go ahead and start, and then turn over to Dennis. But first, I just have to say that it's thank you all for this conversation. I can see in the chat and in the texts I'm receiving, how much people are appreciating the many different angles and perspectives everybody is bringing in. I also want to say that we're here unusually in the summertime for a Columbia University gathering because of the urgency that people feel. But as everybody has said, this is urgent, but it is not new, right? There's nothing about where we are that is new. And, if we to just pull on a couple of points that a number of people have said, we can't separate anything in this country, I believe, from where we started, or from 401 years ago, the enslavement of African people on our shores. There's not a construct of the world where that isn't a piece of what we do. And so I think the questions of thinking about how to move forward must, and as everybody's been saying, take account of a long history, or the most recent killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Tony McDade and so many others before, from both our history and where we are now. So the question is, well, what does it mean to, just to pick up Olati's phrase, to have systemic forms of accountability inside of a university? What does that look like? And what does it look like, to pick up Courtney's point about, to address layers of racial oppression and how they affect an institution at every level, at the very local level, in interactions between students or colleagues, and then in institutional decisions and beyond. So I'll offer a few thoughts and then turn to Dennis, but mostly want to reiterate that let me say this. When University Life first started, in the very first event we held in 2015 was called Race, Ethnicity, and University Life, Teach In and Speak Out. And if there's one thing that I am just especially grateful for in this moment, is the much broader engagement that we are having in these issues. And so my hope is that this conversation, my knowledge is that this conversation will be a piece of a much longer series of conversations. To your question about the NYPD and Columbia's relationship with it, we've gotten a lot of emails on this. There is no contract between NYPD and Columbia for police services. There is what's called a memorandum of understanding that recognizes how the university's Department of Public Safety will work with the NYPD in specific circumstances, including, for example, to respond to reports of missing students or criminal offenses involving violent felonies. This is actually an agreement that the university has to have by New York law. New York requires all colleges and universities in the state to have this kind of agreement. But on the question of broader work, I mean, there's nothing that anybody has said that doesn't make sense, right? To ask questions about our curriculum, to ask questions about how we're teaching our curriculum, to ask questions about who we're hiring, what's getting funded, to ask questions about what we do as an institution to recognize our history and to address it in a vibrant way going forward. So to me, all of these questions are directly on the table and in front of us. Dennis?
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne. I also would like to echo many of your thoughts, but let me please start, as you did, by thanking our panel. These are dear colleagues, and as I said, many close friends. They were outstanding, and this is the beginning of a conversation that we are having as a university. We will continue this conversation. This conversation never ends. It has been around, as far as I'm concerned, for 401 years. We are engaging in this conversation as courageously as we can. And I think today's panel represented that. So thank you to all of you. We do want to continue that conversation. Next week, we will have a similar panel. We're actually entitling it Addressing Racism, a Call to Action for Higher Education. And it will be moderated by June Cross, from the School of Journalism, one of
across the hall colleagues.
Direct colleagues, exactly. And we will have another group of our outstanding scholars who will continue this conversation. It is, and we expect to have more. We're also going to open up some spaces, virtual spaces, so that faculty who have been impacted by these last few weeks, which is almost all of us, can have those conversations. And we're going to move some resources for faculty. And as I said, you'll see this in an announcement that we'll send out tomorrow. It's actually live now on the website, but we'll send out some resources. We're looking to put seed grants in place for our faculty so that they can spend the next year or two putting together intellectual projects that will be helpful to us as a university, to our students, to our faculty, but also to our nation and our city, which is suffering. So we're excited about that. And we're going to partner with those of you who did not know Courtney Cogburn. You got to know her today. And we're going to partner with her and her colleagues at the School of Social Work to really put on what we're calling a mini institute for our faculty to help them move through these issues of race and racism in America. There's a particular core curriculum class that they teach at social work called Prof. Courtney is a big piece of this, Power, Race, Oppression, and Privilege. So we're going to do this mini course for our faculty this summer, and depending on how it's received, we'll consider even moving a second version into the fall. So as Suzanne said, we're going to work over the summer as a beginning, as a start to this. There's no sense, we're not fooling ourselves into believing that a couple of virtual conversations can solve these issues that are centuries old. But we are going to jump into it as courageously as we can.
If I might just add 3 quick points for students, you can, and anybody in our community or elsewhere, you can turn to University Life's webpage, either live now or by tomorrow morning, for a pretty extensive list of resources and also ways to get involved both in and outside of the university. I want to again invite you to join us next Wednesday as part of University Life's ongoing task force on inclusion and belonging, which was the place where the sort of a series of activities and engagements, not only for students, but also for staff and faculty, have come out. And my hope is that these will expand even further throughout the university. And third, we'll pair a little bit with Dennis's office to provide some mini grants for students along some of those same lines that Dennis was talking about.
So I have a question that actually touches on something that Suzanne mentioned, which is how do we uphold the true meaning of Black Lives Matter while neglecting to address the violence Black trans people are subjected to? Why is there a lack of advocacy for trans people of color? Tony McDade was not mentioned in this time as much.
I did just mention Tony McDade, and actually in a little bit of a glitch in my introduction that where I intended to mention Tony and a number of other people, it somehow dropped out of my introduction. So I wanted to be sure as the first thing I said was to recognize not only Tony's name, but a number of others. Look, I come out of the LGBT advocacy movement, and issues of trans people generally and of trans people of color and Black trans people in particular have long been under the radar and do not tend to receive as much attention because of the intersections of multiple points of marginalization in our society. I think that's starting to shift, and in fact, the attention to Tony McDade's killing is part of what is helping to shift that. In law, we often see that very terrible things in the world can be a pivot point for drawing more systemic attention and developing not only sort of a moment of awareness, but advocacy for more systemic change. And so my hope is that will be something that comes from the increasing awareness of Tony McDade's death and the death of many other Black trans people and trans people of color around the country and around the world, frankly.
Can I just jump in here real quick? I have a response to that comment question, the question that Professor Cobb rose. I think one of the things that makes this moment of Black activism distinct are the ways, and again, others have said this, I'm not saying anything novel, are the ways in which sexuality is foregrounded by contemporary Black activists in ways that they were not back in the day, the way they're building on Black feminist thought, going back to the Combahee River Collective, on and on and on until the present. And so what is exciting about our moment is there's a way in which we can talk. We have to talk about Black liberation and white supremacy, but in an intersectional manner, right? And for those of us who are not in the university, right, that means like being attentive constantly to the ways in which racism intersects with sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and class stratification, right? Activists have been showing this, right? And as we move forward as an institution, and many of us and people on this panel know this already, we have to frame our solutions along with that sensibility, right? The answer to our question or our challenges at Columbia is not to hire distinguished Black male faculty making large salaries, right? As a kind of representative gesture, right? There's something more transformative that has to happen as a result of the moment we're living through right now that really speaks to a kind of politics of institutional transformation and not just inclusion and diversity, right? And we are all well aware, I'm sure, of the kind of challenges that inclusion diversity work entails. But I think part of the answer here is to not find minoritized people and make them the new generation of Columbians, but to really re-envision what a Columbian looks like on the student and the faculty level for the 21st century. I think our students already show us that all the time. I'm sure we see this in the classroom. Bob was alluding to this earlier. And I think that has to translate into the policies that we start putting in place in the future, because this panel should show that there are many Columbias, right? Even my own research on the '68 protests at Columbia, right? There's no one Columbia, right? Vis-a-vis Harlem, there are various Columbias that were actually advocating for all sorts of plans for envisioning the institution's relationship to New York City and the surrounding community. And I think that's the kind of sensibility we need to have as we move forward, internally in terms of dealing with our institution itself, and then outward-facing work as we move forward.
I have another question, which is, how can international support for the movement be harnessed to great change here? And I'll take the moderator's prerogative and offer a few thoughts on that before I open it up for anyone else. One of the things I think that's remarkable about the United States is that in offering itself up as the exemplary nation and declaring itself to be exceptional, it kind of vaults itself into a position of preeminence in the world, socially, economically, culturally, and various other ways. But it also leaves itself open to a great degree it makes itself very vulnerable to international embarrassment. And this has been the history of the United States even before it was a superpower. And so when we think about, Frederick Douglass, and, the real outrage of Frederick Douglass was not escaping slavery, but denouncing American slavery in London. That's when people really were angry about what Frederick Douglass was doing. The same thing happened with Ida B. Wells and lynching. When she went abroad and spoke about what was actually happening in the United States, and being a country that has always had this inferiority complex as it relates to Europe in terms of culture and distinction and so on, it was a huge embarrassment. And you saw the attacks on her intensify specifically because she was talking about these things in an international context. The same we could say about Paul Robeson in the 20th century. We could go on with the civil rights movement and the international attention that it generated specifically in the context of the Cold War. This happens again and again and again. And so I think that by simply showing up to protests, and I was working on something today and looked up the places where there had been protests and then just had to stop because there were protests in Brazil, in Belgium, in Germany, in the UK, in France, in South Africa, in Tanzania, in Kenya, in Ghana, in Italy, in Spain, and on and on and on, like dozens of countries that were rebuking the United States for its egregious racism. And I think that present administration accepted one of the mechanisms for social reform, or one of the mechanisms that has helped pave the way for social reform, is the desire of the United States to take that embarrassment card out of contention from foreign powers. Certainly the United States does not like being upbraided on this issue as it was by China as it was by Iran, and as it was shockingly by Russia recently as well. And so I think those are the things that happen almost as a automatic function of the fact that there's so many people around the world expressing their displeasure on this issue. I don't know if anyone else wants to respond to that.
Well, I mean, the one thing that I would add, or maybe just two thoughts, and they don't move in the same direction, so I hesitated to add them. But I mean, one is just about attention, just that it brings to our culture of policing, which is, it's just very distinctive that our police kill so many more citizens and, you know, civilians than you know, happens in any other, well, in Europe, let's just say. You know, there are similar problems in a few other countries, but in Europe, you know, we don't compare well. And so I think it brings attention to our sort of distinctive way in which we deal with things around incarceration, guns, and just the overall levels of violence in American society that I think are inextricably linked with our history of you know, slavery and genocide. So I think that's interesting. But I also think that for a lot of these countries, they're wrestling with their own histories too. And so even as people are, you know, my family is from West Africa. And so I have a lot of family in all of these other countries too, where the protests are happening, like in England, and they have a dual nature to them, which is that they're upbraiding the United States, and then they're also turning and looking at themselves and their own institutions. And I think that's valuable too.
We have lots of questions coming in from Columbia University staff about how they can be included in this work. We've mentioned faculty and students, but I wonder if people could speak to the ways that staff specifically can be included in this work.
Thank you for that question. I'll jump in, and maybe Dennis will add. And I'm jumping in mainly because in the Office of University Life, we work directly with student-facing staff. So if you're a student-facing staff member and you're not already in touch with us, please do come in. Yes, just yesterday there was a community space for student-facing staff to really talk and reflect and think and feel, right? To just take space to feel, and which is not a thing we often do in professional settings, in work settings, but to feel what's going on, not to try to make sense of it all, but just to at least have a space with colleagues to think about these issues. There's a lot more going on around the university for staff as well, but I'll focus there. I'll also add that our University Life Task Force on Inclusion and Belonging has always been open to staff, as well as faculty and students. And in fact, we've had many staff participate and take leading roles in what we do. So we welcome you.
Someone else?
You know, I was just going to say, I'll add to that, Jelani, that, you know, the Office of Faculty Advancement, we deal very closely with faculty-facing staff, which is significant. And we're talking about staff at all levels, including up to our senior administrators that are running our schools. So we've tried really with the crisis that came to us through COVID-19 to do more community building and creating Slack channels and opportunities, virtual opportunities for people to really exchange. And it's been impressive, the number of staff that have participated. We also include the Office of Work Life. And in the Office of Work Life, many of those programs, our wellness programs, many of our programs are directly staff focused, and in particular are usually most frequented and most used by staff as well. So we'll continue to do that. But community building is something that we are moving towards because it's critical. And COVID, as COVID laid bare everything else, all of our other challenges, COVID laid bare the fact that we don't do enough community building.
I just want to jump in real fast because it's related. This question of staff is an excellent one because it is absolutely true that we tend to focus on faculty and student needs. But because we're in New York and because we're in West Harlem, many of the people who work in these jobs, from facilities to office staff, are people of color, people of African descent, right? And it's going to be very interesting to see, including people in public safety, right? I mean, I'm just highlighting the complexities and the challenges that the institution, or the opportunities, I should say, the institution can face, because whatever we're going to be moving forward. I mean, so many of these people travel hours and hours, away to work in Manhattan because they can't afford to live in Manhattan, right? And so the kind of class disparities, if you're paying attention, are very evident, even among people who work for our institution, right? And given that so many of them are Black, it seems to me that the community building work that Dennis is highlighting has to highlight those issues in some way, shape, or form. And I think that the beauty of Columbia is that, and being in New York, is that you really can't hide the disparities. They're out there in public every day, just walking in the neighborhood, right? And there's ways in which I think, as we think about our academic and scholarly work and teaching, those of us who keep the institution afloat are people who have been probably disproportionately affected in some way by what's been happening in recent months.
It's a microcosm for the city and for the country. Given all the protest momentum, how can this be harnessed to make sure that the next period is different? How can we plan, strategize, organize, and mobilize so that we don't have another George Floyd?
I just want to be the guy who repeats something that I said earlier. It's very difficult to sustain this. It's just not. At a point when the nation returns to something that looks like normal, everybody will be about a whole host of other things. And this will be something that when the year's anniversary comes, people say, yeah, George Floyd, ooh, ooh. Now, that's the more pessimistic point of view. One of the reasons I think it's really important for those of us in university settings, we're the ones who don't just keep hope alive. We're the ones who keep the memory and the knowledge that comes out of an intense examination, intense study of the situation. We're the ones who keep that alive, and we're the ones who often drive our students into careers where we're able to make some kind of really important impact. I mean, the simple knowledge that it doesn't last, what do you do to sustain this? If we thought of that as an issue that is worth our study, worth our commitment, worth our investments, especially in material resources like cash, I think it becomes very clear that we can do the thing that I was taught as a doctoral student in higher education and adult education, where I was told the one thing you want to do as an administrator if you're in a situation like this is wait. Because that old adage, this too shall pass, is definitely true. How about we recognize that that's what universities often do? How about we make it clear that part of what we want to do is build in something that looks like permanence, something that looks like sustainability, and make that a commitment that we make to every entering student, every graduating student, so that it becomes really part of our credo, part of our mission, part of what we're known for. I know we can do that, and I think this is the moment to commit to make something really important happen.
I think that's critical, Bob, and just how do we build this effort into our infrastructure of the institution to give it permanence, because this is a long-term problem. And I think to a point that Olatunde made earlier about culture, right? You talk about movies and films and social media movements that have been so critical in this. I think using cultural tools to shape the narrative and continue this conversation going, using social tools, cultural tools, to continue to hold people accountable for the statements that they've released, saying what they're going to do. That is the type of effort that I think is also critical to where we go next. And when we move from the streets back inside, those are the sorts of tools that I think are at our disposal that we need to be leveraging as well.
And so I think I have time to sneak in just one more question, which I will be partial to Frank for reasons that will become apparent soon. What can we do to change education to include the real history of what has occurred? Oh,
is that potentially open-ended? Where's that question coming from?
Well, I mean, it's not my question. It came from outside.
Yeah, I think if there's been anything good about the pandemic is that I find it hard to believe that we're going to return to whatever the normal was. I don't see it happening, actually. On a micro level at Columbia, certainly we're all in the midst of discussing what next year is going to look like. And it's pretty clear that, that it's not going to be what it was before March 7th and whatever we shut things down on campus. And certainly I think that's the case for the society. I think, Bob, your points are absolutely well taken. Like, this is just another moment and it's easy to be cynical. But I think we're going to be returning to something different, because the pandemic's not over. We're in the midst of the reopening now, and that it's just going to impose challenges that are going to force us to be innovative. And it's going to force us to take that innovation and energy and translate it into political action, right? And I think we can do that certainly in the city itself and at the state level. And because of the impending election and the desire to get rid of the person who occupies the White House, there's going to be certain things in place in the foreseeable future that's going to force us to move forward, and that probably has to translate even in the ways that Suzanne and Dennis had highlighted already into the kind of teaching that we do, right, and the kind of research that we support and the kind of things that we invest in that allow us to reimagine what scholarly distinction and education looks like. We're forced to do it. We didn't want to, but now we are. So we might as well take advantage of the moment to do the work. And I know that we're having conversations, even if they're kind of triage mode conversations now on campus, that are trying to think about how we can do this better. And I think that in of itself is going to be an ongoing incentive or coercion to do something different on an educational level and how that translates beyond.
Mm. And I'll add one thing in 30 seconds or less, which is that I'm heartened by the movement we've seen around universities and slavery, that there are courses, Georgetown, Brown, they have courses on the way in which their institutions benefited from the existence of slavery and kind of confronting, that history of what has happened. And I think that there are lots of people, really young, smart, history-minded folk who are interested in making sure that these questions don't, exactly the thing that we're talking about, that they don't go unremembered and that they don't fall by the wayside. And my last comment is to actually commend Frank and Courtney and Bob on their excellent selections of artwork as backgrounds. And Suzanne as well, I'm gonna go get myself a painting or something to stick back here. While I'm talking, I just have a TV, you can see, which makes me look quite uncultured. But I want to give Suzanne and Dennis a moment to close this out, and I want to reiterate my thanks to the panel and to all of the participants and everyone who came by to listen to this conversation.
Jelani, thank you so much. Dennis, shall I turn it to you and then I'll close out? Do you want to jump in for a couple of words before I close us out? Great.
I will, just to really, again, but also the audience. We can't see you. I know you can see us, but the thought that over 2,000 of you did to begin this conversation with us here, but also with us as a university, we're grateful. And it's the beginning. Please stay with us as we move through this process. Thank you.
I echo that completely. I think one of the things that is most powerful about this moment, and that I think has happened to many, many people and many people who are not Black, in seeing the video of George Floyd being killed, is that it forced people to bear witness to what maybe people had as an idea or had read about in the media somehow, but hadn't taken it into their hearts. And as a sort of someone who's done a lot of advocacy over a lot of time, I've always deeply believed, right, it's a mix of hearts and minds to move forward, and we need both. And that's, I think, a place where universities can excel, or we can excel in this moment. Right, that the momentum is an invitation. It's certainly a demand, but also an invitation and an opportunity to build, to create, to keep asking ourselves, not just now, but embedded over time in a permanent way, as Courtney was saying, about what we do as an institution, as small communities within an institution, and as we work within the broader society to contribute where we can, to use what we know, and also in a very important and special way to bring forward our imagination to what we don't yet know, but what we might know when we bring ourselves collectively together on these issues consistently and relentlessly over time. So I'm just deeply, deeply grateful to all of the panelists for giving us your time in this very busy period of time for each of you, for sharing your insights, for sharing your expertise, for the work that you do. I'm grateful to everybody who has joined in, to have taken the time to think about these issues and think about how you are going to do your own work leaving after this conversation today. You'll find the edited recording of this discussion on University Life, Columbia University Life's website at the beginning of next week. And I encourage you to pick it up and share it out. And I encourage you to join us for all of the other activities and events we've mentioned that are coming up and that will be coming up in the coming year. So with that, please join me all in thanking our panelists for an incredible conversation, really a gift to all of us. Thank you so much.